Hi everyone, I'm Jess from Minerva here today to share with you a sew-along tutorial for the Simplicity Pattern 1459 to help you make this vintage inspired 1950s dress. There will be some information for if you are new to sewing or commercial patterns, as well as the step-by-step tutorial itself. You can save this video to refer back to later, and as usual you can find all of the products and materials mentioned in the video linked below for your convenience. I recommend watching this video all the way through first to familiarise yourself with the pattern, and also throughout and at the end there will be some tips and tricks that I used along the way to help you and get your creativity going. Before we start, let's take a closer look at the pattern. As you can see, the pattern comes with 3 standard variations. The basis for each one is a full skirt that finishes just below the knee, a fitted bodice with the front and back darts and an oversized collar. Version A comes with elbow-length sleeves and a ribbon belt that hides the waist seam. The same ribbon belt is on version C, however this is a sleeveless option. And version B has a separate lightweight outer skirt with a cummerbund and a short sleeve variation. Obviously you can mix and match the belt styles if you want to make one at all, and go with whichever sleeve option you prefer. For this video I'll be making variation C with the shorter sleeve from version B, but we'll go over the other stages for the different variations as we go along. Turning the packet over, you'll find the suggested fabric list, which I will talk about more shortly, and the materials list for each of the pattern variations, as well as the yardage for each of the fabrics. It also has requirements if you want to add the additional skirt lining or net underskirt. So let's talk about the fabric suggested for this project. For the main bodice and dress, the pattern is quite versatile and suited to many fabrics. If you're going for more of a day dress, then you can use a lightweight woven fabric such as cotton or linen types, or for a more evening style dress you can use medium weighted woven fabrics such as damask or taffeta. If you're making version B with the overskirt layer, you will want a lightweight fabric such as a georgette or organza. For my dress today, I'll be using this Lady McElroy Cotton Lawn fabric, which has a beautiful, bold but minimalist navy floral outline print on a cream background with yellow accents. Of course, we'll also be needing thread. Once you've chosen your fabric, our site has a great feature that allows you to add the matching thread to your basket for your chosen fabric without you having to hunt for it yourself. I'll be using a cream Gutermann polyester thread. You will also need some interfacing for around the collar, and for that I am using the Villain Super Stretch interfacing, which I will iron onto my fabric to give it some stiffness. You will also need a 40cm zip. I'll be using an invisible one, but you can use a normal zip as well, like this, that matches your fabric. This will be inserted onto the left side seam. We will also need 2 buttons for the front of the dress. I will be using these bold dill round plastic buttons, which are 2.5cm in diameter. Lastly, for the dress you'll need 1 pack of hem tape, like this hemline bias cut white hem tape. This will be for the bottom hem of the dress. As I will be making the ribbon belt, I will be using this bright yellow ribbon to match the colour palette of the dress, and you want a ribbon which is between 3 or 4 centimetres wide. This belt will be held closed by 2 pairs of hook and eye fastenings. I will be using this pack of Prem hook and eyes. Now I've got everything together, let's get started. When you open the packet you'll find the thin pattern sheets and the instructions. Let's look at these first. The first page comes with an illustrated key to understand the different icons used throughout the instructions and a cutting layout guide. These layouts are a suggestion. If you are pattern matching with a particular fabric, you may need to position these pieces slightly differently. Just remember to take into account the grain line on each of the pattern pieces. And then of course you have the instructions as well for each of the stages. Going back to the pattern sheets themselves, you can iron these on a low heat to get the creases out of them, which makes them a bit easier to cut. Find the pieces you need for your chosen variation and cut all of them out to your size. Each pattern tells you what it's for and how many of which fabric you need to cut out. Once you have all your pieces cut out, it's time to put them together. Regardless of what version dress you are making, the bodice is the first thing to go together. All the pieces have a 1.5cm seam allowance unless otherwise stated on the pattern piece or in the instructions. On the bodice piece you will see there is an alteration line. This can either be left at the full length or it can be shortened to accommodate a shorter torso. For myself, I am making the altered version. On the two front bodice pieces, which are number 1s, stay stitched from the front up to the shoulder along the neck edge 1.3 centimeters away from the edge of the fabric. Doing this along the curved edge prevents stretching as we sew. Next, we need to close up the two darts that help give the bodice shape. To start with, transfer the dart markings to the material with fabric pen. Then, with right sides together, pin the fabric so that it folds along the center line. You can draw along the stitching line to help guide you as you run the fabric through the machine. To sew the dart, position your fabric so you start at the wide end of the material and then sew a straight line towards the dart point, and then continue off the end of the fabric for a few stitches. There are several ways to finish a dart, but this is my preferred method. Without cutting the thread, lift the needle and reposition the fabric so the needle is now on the folded edge of the fabric. Make a few stitches and then secure the line with a knot. As you can see, this secures the thread tail while leaving a crisp point at the end of the dart. I'm going to sew all of the darts before I press them. Do not backstitch at the tip of the dart, as sometimes this can create a bubble at the tip of the dart, which means it will not lie flat. When pressing a dart, start on the back side of the fabric. Always press the dart towards the center of the piece, avoiding the very tip of the dart for the moment. Once you're happy, flip the piece over and press again, this time the entire length of the dart. Moving to the back piece of the bodice, which is number 2, again we need to top stitch along the neck edge and then sew the back darts the same as we did for the front pieces. Once you have your back piece and both front pieces done, we now need to join them together. To do this, match the seams with right sides together. Then sew the shoulder seam and the right seam the full length of the pattern piece. With the left side, we are going to sew down the seam from bottom of the armhole down to the notch, back stitch for a few stitches to secure the seam. This side is staying open as we will later be adding in the zip here. Once you have sewn all your seams, press each one so they lie flat. At this point, you can put the bodice on to see how the shaping looks. Pin the front openings together where the buttons would go and check you're happy with the shape of the fit. Playing about with the width and length of the darts can change the shape around the bust and the waist. I will talk a little bit more about shaping at the end of the video if it's something that applies to you. As you can see, I have overlocked the raw edges of the side and shoulder seams. Now the darts are in place and I'm happy with the fit. The instructions don't say to do this, but as the bodice is not lined, I wanted the edges to have a nice finish. If you don't have an overlocker, you can use a zigzag stitch on a normal machine. Moving on to the collar, which is piece number 3, first we need to apply fusible interfacing to one of the pieces of the collar. We do this to add stability to the fabric. Some application processes vary, but generally fusible interfacing is added like this. With your iron heating up, match up the interfacing with the sticky bobbly side to the wrong side of your fabric. Using a scrap piece of cotton as a barrier to prevent the fusible sticking to your iron plate, iron over the fabric. Test the corners to make sure there is no peel back. If the two layers are not fusing, you may need to use the iron on a higher setting. Next, pin the interfaced fabric to the second collar piece with right sides together. Stitch along the seam lines on the outer edge. Once you've gone around the whole edge, go back over the same line around the inner corners to reinforce the seam. Slash between the stitching lines, trim the seam allowance back. We then need to understitch around this edge by pressing the seam forwards towards the facing and stitching through the seam allowance. Turn the collar right side out completely and press. Along the inside edge, machine or hand baste the pieces together with long stitches. To attach the collar to the bodice, pin the collar to the neck edge of the bodice using the dots from the template pieces to help line them up. Again, sew a line of baste stitches along the seam, either by hand or using the machine. Moving on to the facings, you'll need to apply fusible to pieces 4 and 5 and then join them together. We then need to finish the edge on the outside. To do this, you can overlock, as I have done here, or use a zigzag stitch or a narrow rolled hem. We are doing this as this edge will sit against your skin on the inside, so you'll want a smooth finish. I also overlocked the edge of the seam allowance on the shoulder seams to prevent fraying. To attach the facing, pin right sides together over the top of the collar and sew. If you have made alterations to shorten the bodice like I did, you may find that the bottom of the facing will overhang. Don't worry about this, it's just because the interfacing comes as a set pattern piece and isn't altered the same as the bodice. Once attached, trim and notch the seam so that it sits flat. Turn the facing to the inside and press. Depending on your fabric type, you may want to use a cotton scrap to protect your fabric while pressing. Once pressed, hand sew some tacking stitches at the shoulders, securing the facing panel to the seam allowance, either side of the shoulder seam, to prevent it from moving. The last step for the collar is to top stitch under the collar close to the neck seam all the way around, from one centre front to the other. Now we need to make the buttonholes on the right front panel. Start with transferring the position markers from the template piece if you haven't already. There are several ways in which you can make buttonholes. I will be using this buttonhole foot and the buttonhole setting on my machine. I will go over some alternatives at the end of the video about buttonholes and fastenings. With your buttonholes finished, line up the two panels and mark on where to sew the buttons on the left-hand panel. Sew the buttons on either by hand or using your machine. And lastly, just to make manipulating the bodice a little easier later on when we're attaching the skirt, run some basting stitches across the bottom of the bodice centre through all the layers, keeping them together. Now the bodice is finished, let's move on to the skirt. Stitch skirt pieces which are number 8s together. With right sides together, sew the full length of the right hand seam from the waistband to the hem. On the left hand side, use the notch as a marker for where to stop your line. The top section of the seam should be left open as we will add the zip in here shortly, so only sew down from this point. The first step here is to gather the top edge of the skirt at the waistband. To do this, we need to run 2 lines of long stitches just above the seam line at 1.3 centimeters and 1/6 millimeters up from there. You may want to draw these lines on your fabric. Make sure to use the longest stitch possible on your machine. At this point, measure the inside circumference of the bodice piece. This will give you the final measurement for the waistband of your skirt. There are a couple of ways you can go about gathering, but this is my preferred method. On one side, I tie the threads together so I can't accidentally pull them all the way through from the other end. I find the top thread on both lines and hold them taut and slowly slide the fabric along them. Keep doing this until the skirt length matches that of your bodice. Make sure to keep the gathers even so there will be no gaps in the pleats once the bodice is attached. With right sides together, pin the skirt to the bodice at the waistline, matching the seams together. Hand baste a couple of points around the waist to reduce movement as it goes through the machine. Then sew the bodice and the skirt together. With them now joined, press the seam, turning the excess up towards the bodice. At this point, there's an option to add a net underskirt or lining. For the lining layer, stitch the number 9 skirt pieces together, leaving the top left seam open as we did for the other layers. You do not need gathering for this layer. With the wrong sides together, pin the lining to the waistband, baste stitch if you feel you need to, then stitch the lining layer into the seam allowance of the waist seam. When attaching either of the layers, take care not to sew through all the layers of the bodice or the stitching will be visible from the outside. Baste the openings on the left hand sides together. Next we need to add the zipper. We'll be putting the zip in so that one side makes a flap that covers the teeth so the zip will not be visible. Start with pressing the front side of the opening under by 1.5 centimeters and then the back side of the opening by 1.3. I am using an invisible zip here, but it's perfectly fine to use a normal zip. With the zip open so the toggle is at the far end and out of the way, line up the right side of the zip with the pressed edge of the back side opening. I lined up the zip so the tabs were above the starting point of the opening. This will ensure that the zipper tab will go all the way to the top and not leave any opening between the zip stopper and the seam opening. With an adjustable zipper foot, stitch down the length of the opening, staying close to the pressed edge. For the other side, first close up the zip so the toggle is at the top, then pin the zipper tab to the pressed edge. You can base stitches along this line if you wish, at 1 centimetre away from the pressed edge. We will also be squaring across the top and bottom, 3 millimetres in from the seam closures. This will ensure that the flap we created will sit smooth and perfectly cover the zip. Now for the sleeves. If you are adding sleeves, the first thing to do is sew 2 lines, the same as we did for the waistline, around the top of the sleeve, between the 2 notches. This is what we call the sleeve ease. If you are making variation A, the longer sleeve option, you will need to sew up the darts at the elbow the same way we did for the bodice. As you can see with my 2 sleeves, I have put a single pin on the sides which will become the front of the sleeves. This is so once they are together I won't get muddled up with which is the left and which is the right. For both versions, it's time to close the seam up. Join with right sides together and then sew down the length of the arm. For version B, finish the unnotched edge with either a narrow hem, zigzag or overlock and press under. Both versions slip stitch with an invisible edge around the whole edge of the sleeve. If you are unsure about the length of the sleeve, you can wait until the sleeve is attached so you can try the dress on before making any adjustments to the length of the sleeve. To do an invisible hem, start with pinning the hem to prevent twisting as you work your way around the sleeve. When you're doing this, make sure you use a matching thread. I'll be using a bright thread for the demonstration just so you can see it a little bit easier. Anchor your knotted thread in the seam allowance from the side seam. Then, moving roughly ½ inch, careful to stitch through only the back layer of the fabric from the right to left, keeping close to the hemline. Keep your stitch as small as possible. Then move along at roughly another ½ inch to the right, and again stitching right to left, this time only through the turned up hem. You do not want to be catching the fabric from the front here. As you can see, it will start to look like a line of tiny X's. Continue all the way around, making sure you keep the tension just right so that it doesn't pull or twist the fabric. Eventually you have a stitched line like this on the inside, but on the outside it looks like this. If done correctly, you should not see any thread from the front. Even with this bright thread, you can barely see any of the stitches. Now it's time to attach the sleeve. Turn the sleeve the right way out and the bodice wrong way out. Slot the arm into the armhole, making sure you have the right sleeve on the correct side. Pin the sleeve to the bottom half of the armhole between the small dot markers you have on your template piece, and using the underarm seam to make sure everything is aligned. We will then be manipulating the sleeve head to fit the armhole. If you are concerned about the fabric moving, you can hand baste it first. As we did with the waistline gathers, I'm going to tie off one side and then carefully gather along the top of the sleeve head until I have smooth, even pleats that fit inside the armhole. Pin and hand baste these gathers into position so they don't move. Sew all the way around the armhole and then sew a second line 3 millimeters away from the first into the seam allowance. This will help secure and strengthen the sleeve. If you are not adding sleeves, you need to apply interfacing to the armholes, which are pieces number 11 and 12. Join these with right sides together and then finish the unnotched edge. With right sides together, close up the underarm seam all the way, but for the left side, only sew down to the notch before securing with backstitch. This will ensure that the facing doesn't get caught up in the zip from behind. Pin with right sides together so the facing is on the outside of the bodice and then sew around the armhole. Trim and notch the seam before pressing to the back and understitching all the way around. And now all that's left to do is hem all of the skirt layers. Lastly, put the dress on so you can check the length. You can obviously vary the length how you want, but the hem length will vary with your height. As I am quite short, the unfinished hem finished much lower than it does on the illustration on the packet. If you are adding a separate net petticoat under the skirt, make sure you put this on too when deciding the length of your dress so that it doesn't end up coming too short with the extra volume underneath. You may need a second person to help you measure how much you need to take the hem up by. In my case, I needed the hem to be 24 centimeters higher than it currently is. With that measurement in mind, I mark up a line 22.5 centimeters up from the bottom all the way around, and then trim this away. Then fold the excess hem up by 1.5 centimeters and press all the way around. This hemming tape that I am using literally works as normal sticky tape. So I will be placing half of it over the edge of the hem and half over the back of the skirt. Again, I'm using my scrap cotton press cloth. as I don't want any of it sticking to the iron plate. And in small sections, I position and press the tape all the way around the hem. With this hemming tape, the hem doesn't require any stitching and there's nothing that's going to be visible from the outside. I would recommend doing a small test on an offcut of your chosen fabric with the hemming tape, just to make sure that they do actually adhere well and that the hemming tape can support the weight of your fabric. Also check that you don't get any fused marks that will be visible from the outside. The type of tape described in the instructions requires it to be stitched all the way around, so personally of the two types I would use the one that I ended up picking, as it is less labour intensive. If you have the overskirt, which is version B, hem the main skirt layer first and then finish the overskirt with a narrow hem so that it finishes just below the main skirt. If you have a lining layer, you want this to finish roughly 1 centimetre above the main skirt hemline. If you have a net layer, simply measure and trim away the lower edge so that it is a fraction shorter than the main skirt. This will ensure that you do not see it from the outside as you move. You may find it easier to do this by eye than with measuring, so you can move as you trim. If you do use this method, be sure to hang the dress up on the door frame so that you can be eye level with it, or put it on a mannequin rather than laying it on the floor and cutting it like that. And now for the ribbon belt. Firstly, use the template piece number 16 to get the length of the belt. Press under 1 centimetre at the end of each of the cut lengths. Then, with wrong sides together, if your ribbon has correct sides, stitch all the way around the outside. As this stitching is visible, you'll need to take this into account when buying your materials. Ideally, you want a thread colour that matches your ribbon. To make the bow, cut the length of your ribbon using piece 17 as a guide. Then sew them together all the way around the outside. Next, transfer the centre line to your ribbon. Turn the ends of the bow to the underside, overlapping them slightly at the centre line, and then sew through all the layers. If it starts moving as you sew, you can put a small base stitch along the centre line to help keep the layers together. You can vary the width of the bow as you please, by changing how much they overlap. On your belt piece, choose one end and mark at a point 1.3 centimetres from the end, and then match the centre line of the bow to this mark. Stitch along the centre line again through all of the layers, joining the bow to the belt. Again, you can hand baste them into position first if you think they're going to move. To make the knot for the bow, cut a 9 centimetre piece of ribbon, which we are then going to pleat long ways so that it ends up measuring 2.5 centimetres. You can use a single piece of ribbon if you please. Place the knot piece around the bow, overlapping at the back, and hand stitch into place. Then sew 2 hooks to the underside of the bow end of the belt. Then, with the dress on, wrap the belt around your waist, crossing over the ends of the belt to be as tight as you want it. Then join the 2 sides of the fastenings together and mark on the point to which to secure the other half of the fastening to the back end of the belt. Finish, I just wanted to go over a couple of other tips that I picked up along the way to help you in case you get stuck as well. To start off with, I wanted to talk a little bit about the shaping darts that we've got in the bodice. We use darts to give shape to the garment. Playing around with the length of the dart and the width will change the shape of the bodice. If you are making any alterations, especially to the waist dart, make sure you make note of those on the instructions. The reason that you need to write down any changes you make to the waist dart is so that when you attach the waistband on, you make sure that you shrink it down to the same. As this skirt is put on with gathers and just made to fit the width of the waistband, you don't need to worry quite so much about altering the bodice. If you think you might need to make major alterations to the bodice, then I recommend making a mock-up first, rather than playing around with it made up in your fabric, just in case you make a mistake or you have to keep undoing it. One thing to bear in mind with the skirt is you do end up with a seam down the front of the skirt. You can, with careful pressing, you can hide it, but it is something to bear in mind. Also with the skirt, I just wanted to talk about a little bit about the volume and shape. The design of the net layer that came with the instructions will make it act more as a stabilizer than a volumizer, which is why I chose not to make one. Instead, what I did was I have 2 layers of petticoats on mine to give the skirt the correct silhouette. If you are adding a net layer, I definitely recommend using a lining, as the netting fabric can be a bit irritating against your skin. I also wanted to touch on different variations you can do for the front fastenings. You can make buttonholes without using the buttonhole foot that you can put onto the machine. You just need to make sure that either side of the button you add a few millimeters so ensure you can push the button through the buttonhole with ease. You can make buttonholes by hand, but again they're quite fiddly, but just make sure to reinforce the area with some thin cording to add strength and stabilization. And also omit the buttonholes altogether. Instead of making the buttonholes, what you can do is simply just use poppers to then close up the top of the bodice. You do need the bodice to open, because you'll find it very difficult to get in the dress with only the side zip. You aren't able to open the bodice up as well. If you have a fuller bust, you may want to consider using poppers as well anyway, as the space between the two fastenings is quite wide and you may find that you get gapping in between, so you might want to put a popper in the middle in line with the buttons, just for modesty's sake. On a similar note, I wanted to talk about the side zip as well. To be perfectly honest, I didn't like the way that they put the side zip in. I went ahead and just did a test with putting a normal invisible zip, and personally I would prefer to use this method. It is completely up to you. I think this gives a much cleaner finish than with the concealed flap. I hope this video has helped you with putting this project together and given you confidence if you are new to sewing or commercial patterns. If you have any questions or queries about this video, please comment them below and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. And also, we love seeing what you come up with, so if you've made anything from this pattern or indeed others, why not create an account with Minerva to share your projects with our wonderful sewing community and help inspire others. Thank you for watching, and please make sure you come back regularly for more sewing inspiration.